Hello, I'm Jeremiah McCall. I'm a historian, historical game scholar, and a high school history teacher. Today I've been asked to speak about the game Civilization and its portrayal of history for Dr. Steingooler's Computer Games and Society class at UC Irvine. They're playing Civilization 5. My ancient world history classes, as it happens, are playing Civilization 4 and coming to grips with its portrayal of history. Since the games offer very similar models of history in their broad brushstrokes across the series, they can be considered side by side, Civilization 4 and 5. I encourage viewers to use the screenshots here as a guide and explore their own games of Civ 4 and 5. I also suggest viewers explore some of the writings on the subject. While one of my areas of expertise is historical video games, and the analysis of the games as historical problem spaces comes from my experience and framework, the historical investigations or the specific historical claims that are made by Civ 4 and 5 come from a great number of other writers. I encourage listeners to investigate their writings. So let's start with this point first. Historical games are histories. Because history is not only to be associated with textbooks and lectures and the monographs of professors. History is more than that. Quite simply, it's the communication of the past through a medium. That medium, of course, can and often is a written text or lecture, but it is frequently something else altogether. Toys, music, art, film, and even games communicate ideas about the past, the selected ideas of the people communicating. And when they do, they're history. It's important to note, however, that these histories, just as texts and lectures, are subjective and subject to critique and revision. There is no such thing as a completely accurate history. So historical games like Civilization are histories. They present selected ideas about the past. But they are not written histories, nor should they be compared to written histories and considered inferior. Something like video games are bad history because they don't have footnotes. That doesn't make a lot of sense. It's also pretty clear from the work that's been done in other fields like historical film studies that one can only really appreciate games as history by understanding that games are their own historical medium. They are simply different, and they need to be understood as what they are. Not books, not lectures, not films, but games. They are games designed by skilled, purposeful, and creative teams of designers, and are made to be fun and appealing to, hopefully, a large number of people. That's a critical point. Makers of historical games do so not to teach history, but to make a good game. This is important because what makes a good game and what makes a historically more accurate game are often not the same thing. Most designers I've talked to, when faced with a choice to make a game historically more accurate or more fun, go with the fun. That's their job when they're designing and what are intended to be commercially successful games. So rather than asking whether one can get good history from a game, the better question is, how does being a game shape the historical material presented? So let's understand historical games as historical games, or what I will call Gamic Histories. I've developed a method for analyzing and understanding Gamic histories called the historical problem space. Simply put, historical games present the past in terms of a player agent, a protagonist if you will, in a set of systems connecting a virtual world, attempting to achieve one or more goals and working with, against, or around a variety of elements in that virtual world. And so the player forms strategies and makes decisions about how to navigate the problem space, capitalize on the helpful elements, and avoid the negative elements, ultimately achieving the game's goals. If not all, then the vast majority of historical games do this, and it's safe, I suggest, to call this in some respects a fundamental nature of the medium of the historical video game. No matter the topic, the historical video game makes it into a historical problem space. One of the implications is that the elements of a historical game will portray the past the way that they do in order to work with the designed systems of the problem space. That's something I hope to make clear as we go along. So let's break down Civilization 4 and 5 in terms of the historical problem spaces they present and see what these Gamic histories suggest about the past. First, we should consider the genre conventions of the games, because a game's genre will heavily influence the historical problem space that the designers design. Indeed, genre is often the first consideration when studying a historical problem space. I've been recording a podcast this past year or so talking with different historical game designers, and I'm increasingly struck by the simple fact that historical game designers, because they're game designers, start with an idea about the type of game they'd like to make. So it's important to recognize that it's not like the designers of Civ 4 and 5 said, I want to make a game about ancient civilizations. What would be the best genre for that? The series was 15 years old and had passed through 3 versions before Civ 4 came out, and it was almost 20 years old when Civ 5 came out. These designers were not hired to design some kind of game that presented the growth of human political groups, civilizations, from the ancient to the modern era. Their job was to make a 4th and 5th iteration of games in the Civilization series. They were working in a genre from the very beginning, and genre matters. A Call of Duty World War II game will present the past through what it emphasizes and de-emphasizes and allows players to do. It'll present it differently than a turn-based strategy game on World War II or an adventure game on World War II. So what are the hallmarks of the genre? These screenshots from the Civilization games 1 through 6, an almost 30-year span of games, hint at the features. Sid Meier pretty much pioneered a new genre when he created Civilization, the 4X genre. X is for expand, explore, exploit, exterminate. More specifically, Civilization histories have these common features. They are competitive, which makes sense because they're games, and for some, conflict and competition with rules and a score are standard features of games. Victory by conquering all the other civs and by winning the space race to colonize a new planet are the standard 2 routes to victory. They are based on this somewhat ambiguous human political and cultural grouping, the civilization, which remains fundamentally the same in terms of culture and identifying features across 6,000 years. They all require civilizations to explore a map to find the best places to build cities and locate resources. They all encourage civilizations to expand by planting additional cities after the first one on a world map with terrain and resources that have effects on unit movement and on the cities they've planted. They all have cities as the producers of society, making the units, building the buildings and wonders, researching the technologies. They're all turn-based, so players can pause and think about their actions with each turn representing 1 or more years of a civilization's existence. They provide a look through time of this civilization. So with these and other features of the genre, Civilization 4 and 5 are going to give us a 4X history of world civilizations, not a story version or an academic book version, or even a platformer video game version or a first-person shooter version. A 4X history of world civilizations is what the designers aimed for and what they crafted. Okay, we've sort of previewed the genre and hopefully stressed that the designers, generally like most commercial game designers, wanted to make an entertaining and hence successful civilization game. Now let's get into the problem spaces of Civ 4 and 5 and the ways they present their histories. The player chooses to be the leader of a civilization tasked with guiding it through thousands of years of time, from the construction of its first cities to the 21st century. Ostensibly, the player takes on the identity of a well-known historical figure, say Gandhi, or Mansa Musa, or Queen Elizabeth. In the game, however, the player agent is essentially what can be termed, or it's what I call an experimenting deity. They live an impossibly long lifespan and have a great deal of control over many aspects of their civilizations, kind of like they're some kind of deity testing things out and seeing what the effects of their experiments are on their followers. It's probably a good time to stop too and say a little more about the concept and term civilization, used for understanding certain large-scale human political and cultural groups, since the player is arguably playing as a civilization more than as a discrete human ruler. The term itself is still often used, but increasingly recognized as problematic, in that it can impose arbitrary commonalities or divisions between groups of people. The term also comes with a value judgment that's better avoided in history, the judgment that certain societies, civilized ones, are more evolved than others. The term is also difficult to consistently apply, as the game shows by including disparate entities such as the Assyrians, the Phoenicians, and the Americans. So really what the games seem to be talking about are essentially culturally homogeneous countries composed of a set of cities and a territory. A single country and people based in a territory that will expand over time but still remain the same country. A number of scholars have written on who is included and who is left out in the selection of civilizations for civilization games. An excellent thought-provoking video on this subject comes from Kyle Kalgren. I also suggest you I also suggest that you read Kanishk Thoreau's essay, Playing with History, What Sid Meier's Video Game Empire Got Right and Wrong About Civilization. These experimenting deity agents and the civilization each leads has a series of victory conditions they can pursue in the virtual world, an important part of the historical problem space. The victory conditions are critical. They're what makes the problem in the problem space. It gives the task that players must complete. And they kind of have to be there. Again, competition or conflict of some kind and some kind of scoring are essential components of games for many designers and theorists. Not all, but many. Two major victory conditions have been with the series since the beginning 29 years ago. One is conquering all other civilizations. The other is winning the space race by having the scientific and manufacturing power needed to build a spaceship to colonize Alpha Centauri. Both Civ 4 and 5 share these victory conditions and add two others that were first introduced in Civilization 3. The first is a cultural victory. A cultural victory in Civ 4 is when the player reaches a certain quantifiable level of culture in 3 of their cities. In vanilla Civ 5, the player must garner enough culture to purchase all the bonuses on 5 groupings of social policies and then build a utopia project. The second way to victory that's been added is a diplomatic victory that is achieved by being in such good standing with all the other civilizations in the game that they vote the player to be their earthly leader. And these goals are pursued on a world map, the space in the historical problem space. It's either a simplified version of Earth and its continents, or a map with terrestrial terrain organized into a different set of land masses and oceans. And the geography of this world map, fictional or stylized and realistic, is a critically important part of the world inhabited by the player's civilization and the computer-run rival civilizations. Indeed, if civilization says anything about the historical developments of large political and cultural groups, it says that geography affects their development a great deal. Different kinds of terrain, like hills and forests, take more turns for units to move through and provide greater bonuses for military units defending there. Only coastal cities have access to the sea and so on. But beyond the significance of terrain is the significance of resources. Key to understanding the problem space that the designers in these Civ games made, certainly in every iteration of Civilization, requires understanding the central role of tangible resources. There are essentially 5 core resources in a game of Civilization 4 and Civilization 5, each with an important function in the game. Food, production, commerce, research, and culture. And one of the expansions to Civ 5 expands to include faith, but I'm not going to spend as much time on that because it's not as core to the game. Let's start first with the core 3 that are necessary for an in-game civilization to function: food, production, and commerce. In the way Civilization presents history, in Civilization's problem spaces, cities are the core of life in civilizations, the place where all production, research, and culture come from. The cities depend upon their surrounding hinterland and their geography to produce these things. Let's take a closer look at city maps. The city is in the center of the map and surrounded by spaces, squares in Civilization 4, hexes in Civilization 5, each space with its own terrain and having its own resources. The city starts with a population level of 1. The space in which a city is planted provided resources to the city. Then, for each population level, the city gets to exploit resources from one space in the city's hinterland. The primary resources, the basic building blocks for the civilization during the entire game, are 3. Food, in the form of bread in Civilization 4 and apples in Civilization 5. Production resources, which are represented as hammers. And commerce, which is represented as gold. Cities then take these resources to build and recruit, research, and make culture. Food is required both to feed the population and, if there's a surplus after the required food is consumed, to grow the population. Harvest enough surplus food and the population level increases by 1. Fail to produce sufficient food and the population level sinks by 1 due to starvation. Production, or hammers, are the all-purpose building resources of the game. Each city can produce one thing at a time depending upon the civilization's level of technology. A unit, such as a scout or a caravan or a soldier, a building in the city, or a wonder of the world like Stonehenge or the Great Library. Commerce, the gold coins, converts into the wealth of society, measured in gold units. This wealth can be used in trade and diplomacy, and to facilitate the buildings of some things. In Civilization 4, it's also the source of research points. 2 additional core resources are produced in cities and complement the basic 3: Culture points, a quantifiable resource that's generated by city buildings, among other things, is used to determine the amount of territory a civilization's national boundaries encompass. That's the colored overlay on the map around from the cities. It's essentially its territory. In Civilization 5, it's also used to purchase social policies which have various impacts on a civilization. Research points are another quantifiable in-game resource. This one's spent on researching technologies. We'll look at that in a bit. These cities and their resources altogether are so critical to civilization's history that they have their own display screens in the game so the player can see exactly how much each of the 5 resources each of their cities produces. And if the player saves the game at different points, a good idea, they can see exactly how the resources exploited and generated by each city change over time. We'll come back to that point too. And just to throw it out there, our World in Data says that in 2007, that was the first time in human history that more people lived in urban areas than rural. So the idea of focusing on cities from the very beginning and making them the center of everything and requiring people to have cities is definitely a point of view, not an established historical fact. Okay, let's talk a bit more about the units and buildings cities can construct by extracting hammers from their hinterlands and spending them on construction projects. Units are the figures, like playing pieces essentially, that civilizations can move around the world map. Kinds of units range from workers, which can modify the geography around a city to modify the kinds of resources it produces, to religious missionaries, to the many different kinds of military units in the game. It's generally necessary for a civilization to have at least a few military units to defend its cities from rival powers. And if the player hopes to achieve a domination victory, access to stronger military units is pretty essential. Buildings, on the other hand, are structures within a city that essentially provide bonuses to one or more of the core civilization resources. They're different than wonders in that only one of a specific historical wonder, like the Hanging Gardens or the Oracle at Delphi or the Great Wall, can exist in a game. In contrast, each city in a civilization can have its own of each type of building. The screenshots here show the building list for a particular Civilization 4 city, which in this instance has a palace, barracks, granary, obelisk, and library, and the Wonder Oracle. The Civ 5 city has a palace wonder and a monument. The effects of various urban structures like libraries and places of worship, not to mention wonders like the pyramids or Stonehenge, are potentially many and difficult to quantify historically. In the game, however, the functions are precise and measurable, often boiling down to increased generation of the 5 core resources. So, for example, some buildings like the obelisk or monument increase culture production, while a library increases research production, and so on. Now let's talk about the research and technology elements of the civilization game space. Where the production of units, buildings, and wonders is the purpose of the hammer resource, researching new ideas and technologies is the purpose of research points, one of the 5 core in-game resources. Much as hammers accumulate in a city over a series of turns in order to build a new unit or building, research flasks accumulate across the whole civilization to learn a new technology. Where each unit and building has a cost in hammers to manufacture, each technology in the game has a cost in research points to fully research. Note that these resources are tied to the geography of the game map. Geography keeps popping up. In Civilization 4, research points are based on the amount of commerce generated in the city squares that are exploited. Certain buildings increase research points generated, like libraries and later on laboratories. In Civilization 5, the research points of a civilization are equal to the number of citizens in each city. Since the city's population level, however, in turn, is based on the available food in the surrounding hinterland, it's safe to say that here too, research potential is connected to geography in the game. New technologies provide one or more of the following benefits: the ability to build new units, not least of all military units, the ability to build new buildings and or wonders of the world, which have an effect primarily on the core resources in the game, the ability to generate more of one or more core resources, and the ability to research new technologies. Additionally, in Civilization 4, researching key technologies allows the player to found one of 6 historical world religions in the game. So the first to discover meditation founds Buddhism, and the first to discover polytheism founds Hinduism. Notice it's the first. Research is very much cast as a competitive practice in the Civilization 4 problem space. All the individual technologies in each game are connected in a technology tree so that earlier technologies, like agriculture, unlock later technologies, like masonry and the wheel. The progression of technologies essentially follows the historical sequence followed by most ancient civilizations, with technologies like agriculture, pottery, and the wheel. From there, the technologies essentially follow the historical path that European states did in the medieval and early modern and modern periods: musketry, electricity, flight, and so on. They end with some of the technologies that have been adopted by many nations throughout the world today: satellites, computers, the internet. So overall, what it means is essentially the tech tree follows the general historical development of Western technologies and Western nation states. It's also worth pointing out that the later technologies on the tree are more expensive than the earlier ones in two respects. They have a higher purchase price in research points, and the player will have to research, spending research points, all the prerequisite technologies to allow a later technology. So, for example, in Civilization 4, the player has to research agriculture, hunting, and animal husbandry, one at a time while paying the required resource points to be able to research horseback riding. In Civilization 5, the player must also research agriculture and animal husbandry in addition to trapping and the wheel before being able to research horseback riding. And of course, research is competitive. Winning the space race requires achieving and implementing advanced technologies faster and more completely. Winning the military struggle often depends on researching and building more effective troops, and so on. Culture points in Civilization, which first appeared with Civilization 3, are an interesting example of what is sometimes called the quantification bias of video games. Computer games are mathematical models. I mean, ultimately they have to be, since the ultimate language of computers is mathematical, right? Zeros and ones. That means that pretty much everything in the game has to be convertible to numbers. It has to be countable. In some cases, that works pretty well with real-life things. For example, resources like food and wealth. Culture, however, is arguably not quantifiable in the real world. I mean, there may be some who try this, but most of us recognize that one cannot quantify and compare the culture number, the culture rank of, say, China under the Han emperors, with Egypt under the pharaohs, or with the Iroquois. In Civilization the game, however, each of these cultures would have a number, a quantifiable culture score. And having a score also comes with having a rank compared to all other civilizations. Culture is generated by all cities, and buildings increase the amount of culture generated. In addition, in Civilization 4, it works so that once the civilization has researched the drama technology, a percentage of the civilization's income may be devoted to producing additional culture, as you can see in the controls that's shown at the top left of the screen. Civilization 5 has buildings that can be assigned specialist citizens to produce even more culture. The effects of culture are several in the game. As I noted earlier, the culture of a civilization determines the extent of its national boundaries. In Civilization 4, it's possible for a civilization with a significantly greater culture than a rival to persuade that rival's border cities to join them, effectively converting them to the player's civilization. In Civilization 5, culture points allow a civilization to purchase social policies that give various benefits to a civilization, mostly having to do with increases in resource production ultimately. Culture points also allow a civilization to generate great people, a special kind of unit representing a historical person like Michelangelo or Confucius, and they can increase the cultural bonuses for a civilization. Ultimately, producing enough culture can lead to victory. In Civilization 4, that requires extremely high culture levels in 3 cities and a high enough overall culture score. In vanilla Civilization 5, the basic without the expansions, one has to generate enough culture to purchase all the advancements in 5 groupings of social policies, which is certainly different. Different game mechanics, certainly, but they have the same underlying core. Generate as many culture points as possible to win a cultural victory. The two games differ in their treatment of religion, though the underlying assumptions are often similar. For a moment, it's worth considering how religion was modeled in the games prior to Civilization 4. Essentially, there were no religions per se, just religious buildings that provided some happiness to a city's inhabitants. In Civilization 1, 2, and 3, these are called the temple and the cathedral. The temple made one unhappy citizen content in the game, and more if the civ had certain wonders or technologies. The cathedral also made more unhappy citizens content. This continued up through Civilization 3. The overall effect was that religion was portrayed in those problem spaces as generic, though vaguely privileging Christianity as the norm, those are cathedrals after all, and had the primary effect of making unhappy citizens feel better. This was important because if the unhappy citizens outnumbered the happy ones, the city would enter civil unrest and cease all growth and production. Civilization 4 was an overhaul, and the religious system was made radically different and more consistent with history. The game included 7 different world religions based on the historical world religions. Any civilization that researched the unlocking technology first discovered that religion. And once a religion was initiated in a city, that city could build missionary units to spread the religions elsewhere. They could also construct 3 categories of buildings that each religion in the game has. Civilization calls them a temple, a cathedral, and a monastery, though the actual names differ with each religion. A temple is what the game defines as a place of worship that adds +1 to culture generation and +1 to happiness. A cathedral is a large and ornate place of worship that generates more culture and happiness points. And a monastery is a place of retreat and learning that generates research and culture. So again, in Civilization 4, we're still on here, these buildings and the element of religion itself, of course, fit fully into the problem space of Civilization 4, the one the designers established. They connect to the main resource variables of the game, which in turn fund the methods of achieving victory. So the temple of a religion adds 1 culture and 1 happiness point. The cathedral increases culture production in the city and can increase happiness if the player adopts that cathedral's religion as the state religion. And the monastery increases culture and scientific research. It's worth noting that each religion in the game functions this way. For good reason. It might prove quite polarizing, if not downright offensive to players, if the designers made some world religions better in-game than others, however one might determine that. And polarizing games tend not to be as successful. In the game manual, they make a note about religion ending, and they leave this illuminating statement. Quote, "We offer no value judgments on religion. We mean no disrespect to anyone's beliefs. We're game designers, not theologians." End quote. So each religion is made functionally equal, and each religion affects the core variables in the game space in the same way. So Judaism and Hinduism and Islam all have monasteries, and all monasteries do the same thing. Another important similarity is that all religions spread in the same way with the same efficacy. Missionaries can bring them to a city, but a city can catch or adopt a new religion if there's a nearby city that has that religion. Just to recap, Civilization 4 brought much greater sophistication to the portrayal of religions beyond the basic generic temple cathedral model. Still, however, the religions, as we should expect from a well-designed game, are fully integrated into the problem space the designers crafted. Civilization 5 went in a different direction with religion, and indeed religion was not in the base game, but came out with the first expansion pack, Gods and Kings. Here I'll make a small apology. Religion is not an essential mechanic to victory, and so I've never spent much time with the faith and religion mechanics in Civilization 5, not enough to thoroughly know it in detail. But fortunately, Fandom has a great Civilization wiki, and it has my back and can give me some of the information. The religion element in the Civ 5 game space is useful because it illuminates how the historical content, religion in this case, gets turned into an element and shaped by the designed problem space. So religion, a highly complex historical phenomenon, is added on and functions like this. Civilizations generate faith points over time, and with sufficient faith points, the player can found a pantheon and adopt religious beliefs. These religious beliefs commonly affect the core resource variables in the game, unsurprisingly. Over time, with enough faith points, a great profit can appear, and the player can create a religion, selecting more beliefs that have effects mostly on the core resources. There are a limited number of religions that can be found, however, and not every civilization can found one. Again, competition is rearing its head. Having a religion, not necessarily founding it, opens a whole set of possibilities for purchasing religious buildings, and here we find the cathedral and the monastery again, to even purchasing military units with faith points instead of golden hammers. And here I want to just take a side note, make a quick note on population happiness because it's important in kind of getting the overall picture of these games. In the first 3 civilization games, the citizens in each city, 1 per population point, are either happy, content, or unhappy. If the number of unhappy people exceeds the number of happy, the city experiences civil unrest, effectively shutting down completely and no longer producing resources or buildings. Civilization 4 and 5 offer more nuanced versions, but they still emphasize that keeping one's population happy is a good thing. In Civ 4, each city has a number of happiness and unhappiness points. Once again, we have an example of phenomena in the real world, happiness and unhappiness, that are not really quantifiable or not really able to be turned into numbers, but they are. If the unhappiness points grows greater than the happiness points, the city is unhappy and has workers that refuse to work. In Civ 4, religious buildings generate happiness points. In Civ 5, happiness points are calculated for the whole civilization, and net unhappiness slows growth and productivity down dramatically. In both games, buildings and luxury resources, gained from the geography of course, generate happiness points. There's lots of other things we could have included. There's so much to talk about in these games, but we're going to end up here. So last but hardly least, Civilization models relations between different in-game civs. The most important relationship, the inescapable one, is competition for resources, income, technologies, cities, militaries, and so on. But there are other relationships. Diplomatic efforts require players to negotiate with computer leaders, giving and getting concessions of value. Technologies, money, and trade resources. Players can also bully and threaten, and be bullied and threatened in return, demanding gifts in return for not going to war. Trading resources can be a very important part of the relationship between civilizations. Starting with Civilization 3, civs could extract two kinds of resources from their lands. Strategic resources for use in building certain military units, and luxury resources that increase the happiness of the civilization that has them. These can play an important role in strategy, as a civilization might have the necessary technology to build cutting-edge military units, but lack the strategic resources required. Or a civilization might require luxury resources to increase the happiness of their cities. A tension that Civilization 5 nuances further, where players' cities there can actively demand certain kinds of luxury goods. And of course, war is an important form of interaction between civilizations in the game. Each unit has a strength value, higher numbers reflecting a militarily stronger or more deadly unit. Combat occurs when the player selects one of their military units and directs it to enter an adjacent space occupied by an enemy military unit. In both Civ 4 and 5, the player can see the odds of success in making such an attack before committing, as you can see in the screenshots here. Once the player commits, the graphics show the combat and each unit reduces the hit points of its opponent. In Civilization 4, a battle between two units lasts a single turn, since the losing unit is completely destroyed. The winning unit could also suffer a loss in hit points, and since a unit is destroyed when it reaches 0 hit points, wounded units will often need some turns to rest and heal to keep them going throughout the game. Civilization 5 adopted a more nuanced version where each unit might lose hit points in a battle, but it generally takes multiple turns of combat to produce a victor and defeated. So war is conducted by units, but it's not just about the units. The units have to be produced by cities using hammers and sometimes strategic resources. Most, if not all, military units in the game can be made only if the civilization has acquired the necessary technology. So, for example, in Civilization 4, as this chart from the manual suggests, archers require the civ to have discovered archery, and bombers require them to have discovered radio and flight technologies. It's important to recognize what this means. If you look at the chart, it kind of makes sense. An archer is significantly less expensive to produce in terms of hammers needed and research points needed than a battleship. This same kind of progressively greater expenses in terms of hammers, research points, and potentially strategic resources exists in Civilization 5, as illustrated here by the hammer costs and increasing combat value of these three units: warriors, musketeers, and machine gunners. Okay, that's a lot of detail. It's time to put this all together. Most of all, the Civilization games are history. They very much are media that take selected elements and ideas about the past and present them. In this case, the selected ideas of the designers and design teams. Not in a vacuum, of course. Like the rest of us, game designers live in a world full of ideas and media and conventions, stereotypes and simplifications, understandings and misunderstandings. It's important to recognize that tracking the origin of designer ideas is often very difficult. There's no simple equation often between how a game of civilization presents the past and what the designer's understanding of the past is. In any event, this point is also important. The civilization games are games. They were made by game designers in order to continue a game franchise that appeals to a broad audience interested in playing civilization-style games. And so, like essentially all historical video games, the elements of the past that the designers selected to present are shaped and organized into a historical problem space. That problem space is a closed functioning mathematical system containing the player and the elements that a player agent must work within to achieve victory. It's worth stressing that the designers were not trying to design the most historically accurate simulation of political entities over time. They were trying to design a good game, a historical problem space game on human political entities over time. And so that is the basic answer to how civilization presents world history. It presents human history, as far as large political entities are concerned, as led by strong centralized governments, located in a geographic arena, and competing with rival civilizations to win in that arena through the more successful marshaling of one or more of the quantifiable resources: food, hammers, commerce, research, and culture. The game presents civilizations as historically competitive and faced with the problem of how to win a quantifiable victory in a world where geography is critical. Still, as I wrote in an essay a decade ago, a game's models of history are not nearly as important as the act of discussing and thinking about these game histories. That's what's important. Play Civilization, play it for fun, but do step back and think about its version of history and decide whether you agree. And so in that spirit, let's unpack a little more of what these games suggest about the history of civilizations. Here my goal is not to get into an assessment of whether and how accurate the game's claims are about the past. In many cases, it depends. Like all games, Civilization simplifies, and many of the historical points the game makes hold up in broad brushstrokes, but not so much under serious scrutiny. But Sid Meier famously said that about his original game, quote, "Everything we needed was pretty much available in the children's section of the library," end quote. So my point is not to list all the things that are historically debatable in Civ 4 and 5. Rather, I simply want to present to listeners some of the things that the Civilization series suggests, some of the ways it portrays the past, and indicate some of the interesting writing on the topic, including concerns about certain messages. In other words, my goal is to foster further discussion. Even though they're games, it's a good idea to be aware of the propositions in them and all media reflecting on humans and what they have done and still do. And again, it's a good idea to look at them holistically, which is what we've tried to do. So first of all, it's important to note that Civilization suggests a lot of things about complex sedentary societies. And as many different people as there are, there's that many different viewpoints about the things it suggests. It suggests that cities are economic and research and cultural hubs closely connected to the hinterlands and needing those hinterlands to survive and grow. It suggests that human societies intensify in the process of extracting more resources from the land. It suggests the importance of trade for increased wealth and as a diplomatic tool. It suggests that the contributions of religion are to culture, learning, and happiness. It suggests, at least it does to me, the expense and cost of war. It takes a lot of resources to have a protracted war. It suggests the centrality of the big five resources in the functioning and growth of complex societies. Food alone is not enough. Resources alone aren't enough, not research or culture alone. They're all important. And both Civ 4 and 5 also model that happiness is important, the happiness of the people in the civilization. It says things about technology having an impact on human societies, and it certainly suggests that there's divisions of labor and specialization. And one could go on. So Civilization says many things in the course of its games. But if we're going to go big picture, what everything is sort of pointing to, certainly a clash of civilizations is one of the things that's critical in Civilization's interpretation. Competition is the name of the game. Be the first to plant cities and take the more advantageous geographical locations. Be the first to research the right tech and found a religion. Research more advanced technologies. Build more effective units. Have more civilizations love you. These smaller competitions culminate in the victory conditions. There's several specific ways to win the game and many ways to lose, And of course, players don't have to pursue the designer's victory objectives. Game studies has a term for this, transgressive play. And one can clearly have a great time with civilization just building and exploring and playing in ways that satisfy the player, but may not be optimal. When all is said and done, however, the challenge of the historical game space that the designers conceived, the goals, spark competition among the civilizations. The diplomatic victory might be considered an exception, but it's not really, for a diplomatic victory requires that the player wins over more civilizations than its rivals. So one of the first things to note is that Civilization 4 and 5 suggest that civilizations often were, and perhaps are, still in competition with each other. Kanishk Tharur has an interesting exploration of this, and I recommend you read it. But perhaps the most resounding grand thesis that civilization has in its portrayal of history is about geography. Geography matters, and it matters a lot. Physical or at least countable stuff, and that stuff coming from geography matters a lot. Essentially, anyone who plays a reasonably successful game of civilization will find that their civ can be graphed as a climbing line, whereas time increases, population increases. And as both increase, resources harvested increase, and hence productive power increases. It's important to think about what this means. Let's try a thought experiment. Suppose two computer AI civilizations with identical playstyles had their starting settlers dropped randomly into a world of Civ 4 or 5. There need to be identical artificial intelligences with identical playstyle to eliminate the variable of having one more effective player and one less effective. Someone with the necessary mathematical modeling skills could predict with quite a degree of certainty which civilization would win the game based on the geography surrounding their first settler and the geography a bit farther out where second and third cities would likely be founded. The better geography would have the more optimal mix and supply of food, hammers, and commerce, not to mention luxury resources and strategic resources. And those core three would drive production of the other two, research and culture, serving as the engine for victory by domination, culture, space race, and quite likely the diplomatic victory. I mean, you have to be a quantifiably important civ to get all those computer civs to vote you as leader, after all. So a strong version of these elements put together would be something like geographic determinism, that one's geography determines how one's culture or society developed. A human political entity's success is militarily, economically, technologically, diplomatically determined by geography. Okay, so that would be an example, and civilization kind of promotes this idea of geographic determinism. It's also important to note that the computer players of Civ, if they were designed to effectively pursue one or more victory conditions, would do it through growth. Civilization is the game of growth. Civs and cities get bigger, harvest more resources, make more things, and so on in a more or less continual process from the very start of the game until the very end. These 2 pages from the Civilization 4 manual illustrate this important point about geography and growth, and it's true in both Civ 4 and Civ 5, and the previous 3 for that matter, and I strongly suspect in the 6th one. In both civilization games, each military unit has a strength rating, and stronger units require more advanced technologies and greater numbers of hammers, and that's the cost listed in the second column of each chart. Don't forget, these hammers are exploited by a city's population, extracting them from the geography of the city's hinterland. They're getting the hammers from their geography. And the research points to gain these different technologies come from either the commerce generated from the hinterland in Civilization 4 or the number of people in the city in Civilization 5. And the costs of the more expensive units and buildings are simply impossible to cover unless the city populations and the resources it exploits increase over time. So geography is what's making it possible to have a stronger military, more advanced buildings. It's all getting linked back to geography and to growth. Civilization also presents the historical Western development of global conquest, industrial and military development, and the acquisition of territory to be generally worthwhile things, or at least valid ways for civilizations to win the competition set up in the problem space. In this sense, they're very much games of colonialism and imperialism. Historically, of course, we live on an earth where colonialism and imperialism were, are, and likely will continue to be of great impact on people. Civilization suggests that these are the primary ways large-scale human, political, and cultural groupings, civilizations, will compete. Even culture takes on an imperialist colonialist tone because one tries to have the dominant culture, the culture that causes one's national boundaries and influences to swell. On a side note, to get a little deeper into the colonial impulse in many games, I highly recommend Nick Gillimorty's essay on colonial, non-colonial, and decolonial. He does this really insightful job pointing out that there's a colonialist impulse in Civilization and a whole lot of other games that's even more basic than the outright imperialism of the game. It lies in the fundamental encouragement and goal setting based around expansion and of bending the environment to one's wishes. He also talks about how one might design decolonial games. It's fascinating reading. I encourage you to give it a look. And the technology trees here are just a reminder. The way to win, generally speaking, is to follow the historical trajectory of Western countries in research and developing technologies, especially lethal technology. That's the primary way to win. And one more time, this is a progressive view of history, a view that civilizations make progress. They just get better and better through time. It's a history about resource exploitation that suggests there's always more to be eked from the land. Now, that's modified a little bit because strategic resources are not always there in infinite numbers, but the food, the productive resources, and the commerce are always there. Sid Meier, in an interview with Kanishk Tharoor, noted that the original design implements a rise and fall mechanics. They actually put that into the game, but players often just went back to a saved game before the decline and then acted in a way to prevent it. So when they started to go downhill, they'd jump back into an earlier save and fix the problem so they didn't go downhill. Effectively, they didn't enjoy the mechanic and it was cut out. In other words, the goal to make a fun game shaped the presentation of history. Not always, but mostly everything is positive, optimistic, and growth-focused. Pollution was a game mechanic in the first three civilizations, along with climate change and the rising of sea levels. Civ 4 removed those mechanics, and if I'm not mistaken, it's because players didn't particularly enjoy those mechanics. And to be fair, the whack-a-mole pollution cleaning in the earlier games was a bit tedious. Civilization 4 created a more general health system. Each city had a health and an unhealth number where certain resources and sanitations and sorts of buildings could increase the healthiness of a population, and industrial fossil fuel using buildings added unhealthiness. Writers like Soares and Macquarie have commented on the problematic implicit approval of ever-increasing expansion and exploitation, all rise and no fall. On a side note, Civilization 6 appears to have gone the same way initially, but then added a couple of expansions to directly address this view of history that seems to be missing. Gathering Storm has, among many other features, climate change and environmental issues, and the Rise and Fall expansion implemented a mechanic where civilizations can go into a period of decline. And just a final note, it's interesting to consider the expansion packs that are made for these and other games because they're quite often not fundamental revisions or overhauls of the game, but just additions to the existing game of new content and perhaps a minor mechanic or two. And so they tend to reveal pretty well what the core historical problem space of the game is. You'll see in the expansion packs what kind of things they can add, and those things will be shaped to the space. So, theoretically, only theoretically, if designers weren't concerned about the fit of the historical material, when they're designing an expansion pack, they could choose any individual or topic or aspect of history. But since they are game designers and concerned with making a functioning, entertaining game, they select content that fits the problem space they've designed. So first for Civilization 4, it was the Warlords expansion, which fit well with the competitive, sometimes militaristic problem space by adding to the military aspects of the game and adding a cast of 6 new leaders, each of which historically engaged in some scale of imperialistic tendencies. Hannibal, Shaka Zulu, Mehmed the Conqueror, and so on. Beyond the Sword, however, suggests it goes beyond the sword and does this by expanding the role of corporations and creating a more nuanced space race victory. The fundamental competitive problem space and what it suggests about human history, however, is unchanged. For Civilization 5, Gods and Kings introduces a whole religious system, but does not change the agents' roles and the problem space and goals so much as just add elements that fit within that system with the faith mechanics. Brave New World, on the other hand, adds a new cultural victory involving elements like tourism. I have not won yet using this pack, but it's worth noting that the fundamental space of the game, a geographic arena with impossibly long-lived leaders of ultra-centralized governments competing according to quantitative goals, is not changed, and the tourism victory seems to function like a weaponized version of culture. Neither of these expansions revises or significantly adds to the victory conditions and core mechanics, nor is it really to be expected they should. The designers developed a core problem space that appealed to fans, and the expansions are meant to build on an existing system and an existing problem space. So there you have it. It's important to talk about games and the historical models that games portray, the ways they talk about the past, and that's what I've tried to do here with you for Civilization 4 and Civilization 5. And once again, there's been a lot of great writing on civilization, and I strongly encourage you to check out these sources that I have listed here. And if you're interested in investigating more about games and history, you can check out the bibliography I have together on gamingthepast.net. Have a good day.